Omaha's news leader, chronicling the stories and people making a difference in our community. This is KETV Newswatch 7's Chronicle.
Hey, good morning, I'm Rob McCartney. 11,500. That's how many human trafficking situations were identified in the U.S. alone in 2019. So this morning, we're taking a look at the issue and how an Omaha organization and the Nebraska Attorney General's office helps the victims. Plus, the effort by truckers to identify traffickers and the victims on the road and how you can help. First, let's take a look at the numbers. These come from the Human Trafficking Hotline. Like we mentioned, in 2019, 11,500 trafficking situations were identified, along with more than 22,000 victims and survivors. Sex trafficking made up more than 8,000 of those cases. Looking at gender, you can see females are disproportionately impacted. And as far as age is concerned, more than 2,500 cases in 2019 involved minors. So those are the numbers, but do you know what human trafficking really is? Who the victims are? May not be what a lot of people think. The Women's Fund of Omaha helps those survivors, and I spoke with Kristen McTaggart about what they do and how you can help.
We work closely with survivors of all types of lived experiences to really inform our work and center their voices in all of the efforts that we partake in.
Human trafficking may not be what people typically think it is, right?
Definitely. There's a lot of narrative and a lot of information out there about human trafficking, in particular sex trafficking, and some of that information is good and some of that information is not necessarily accurate information. So we know that, human trafficking is really, it doesn't exist in a box. It's closely intertwined with other inequities in our community. It's also closely intertwined with other forms of sexual violence and interpersonal violence, such as child abuse and domestic violence.
Is there a typical scenario?
I don't know that I would say typical. I would say, every situation is complex. Every survivor is unique. We know that traffickers will use force, fraud, and coercion to make it so victims don't feel as though they can leave a situation. And that can look a number of different ways. It can mean that they use threats of violence against the victim or the victim's family members or friends to keep them there. It might mean that they threaten to out someone's sexual orientation. They force them to commit crimes that keep them from leaving or from getting another job. So it can look a lot of different ways. There might be some commonalities, but really it's complex and every situation is unique. Typically, survivors are trafficked by someone that's known to them. So it's not necessarily like a random kidnapping and they're forced into trafficking. It's a situation where that individual was known to them, possibly a parent, a family member, an intimate partner, someone that groomed them for this, that they trusted at some point, and that is actively trafficking them or has trafficked them. What the data really tells us is that trafficking occurs disproportionately in the Black community amongst Native American survivors. Black women are only 5% of Nebraska's population, but our research supports they represent half of all individuals that are sold for sex online in our state. We know LGBTQ youth are over 7 times more likely to experience acts of sexual violence. We also know that 11% of those that are being sold for sex in Nebraska are under the age of 21. So that's some of the data that we look at when we talk about what the narrative is around who's most at risk for being trafficked. 40% of the women involved nationally in trafficking are Native American women. And so thinking about what this looks like and who is potentially disproportionately impacted.
Some of this may come down to people may not know what a healthy relationship looks like, correct?
Sure. I think when we're talking about, what it means to end trafficking in our communities or prevent trafficking, one of the things that we have to think about is what messages or what education is done with our youth from very young ages. So what does, What are we teaching them about what healthy relationships look like? What are we teaching them about what consent looks like, how to give and take away consent in a lot of different age-appropriate ways. The most important thing that we have to do is listen to survivors, listen to them when they tell us as a community what they need for support. We're talking about really complex trauma, typically when we're talking about trafficking. So economic security is a significant factor as far as what resources does a survivor have to support themselves, and what resources do they have to access both emotional and physical safety, whether that's shelter, whether that's advocacy support, whether it's leaving the area. I think those are some of the things that we're thinking about when, or that we should be thinking about when we're talking about how to support survivors. The other piece as a community that really falls on us is when we encounter somebody who is a survivor, to believe them and follow their lead on whatever their journey to healing might be. I always tell individuals you should listen to your instincts. Your gut exists for a reason, and it's to keep you safe. And so if it feels wrong, it probably is wrong.
Well, catching the traffickers is a team effort. Nebraska has a human trafficking task force. It's in the Attorney General's office, and Glenn Parks leads it. Now, he doesn't necessarily think there's more human trafficking happening, just that we're getting better at spotting it. And I asked him, just how bad is the situation in Nebraska?
Honestly, Rob, we don't know the extent of it. We don't have really good research, quantitative research. But what I can tell you is it's much worse than most Nebraskans would have imagined at least a couple of years ago. We know this is not only a Omaha and Lincoln problem. We have a map on the Attorney General's website that shows all the spots across the Nebraska that we've had investigations in human trafficking, and it spans the entire state.
And there are different types of human trafficking, right? How do you categorize them?
Sure. So legally in Nebraska, there's exactly two types of the crime of human trafficking. One is sex trafficking and one is labor trafficking. They're both forced labor, essentially. Labor trafficking is kind of more like what we used to think slavery was. Fits that category. That's basically someone coercing or forcing someone else to do something of an economic value without their consent. Sex trafficking is forcing someone to engage in commercial sex, again through coercion, without their consent. It is sex trafficking anytime commercial sex occurs with someone under the age of 18. Whether they appear to consent or not, Nebraska law says that legally someone under 18 cannot consent to commercial sex. So it's automatically a sex trafficking. If it involves someone over 18, then what we as prosecutors need to show is that it was done without their consent.
How are prosecutions going in Nebraska?
Much better than they have been. So the law in Nebraska against first defining human trafficking at all was in 2006. And there wasn't a single prosecution for until 2012, in which there were two. And then again, there weren't for a few years. So I'm glad to say that through some of the education we've done and the training that we've done with law enforcement and prosecutors and just the general public, we are becoming more aware of this. I'm not sure it's becoming worse of a problem, but we're seeing more of it. In 2018, we had 12 prosecutions. In 2019, we had 8 prosecutions. And in 2020, we had 22. So it's a big increase. And already we've had 2 arrests, sex trafficking arrests this year. And so there's a lot of momentum. I feel like we're probably getting our heads around this a little better as a community, as Nebraskans, and as far as law enforcement with police and state patrol and sheriff's offices and the prosecutors across the state.
And along those lines, you lead the Nebraska Human Trafficking Task Force. Who's involved with that, and what's your mission? What are you trying to do?
Yeah, so human trafficking, the Nebraska Human Trafficking Task Force was started by the AG in 2015, and it was designed really. It's a little bit unique compared to other task forces like drug task forces or such, in that it includes kind of a wider variety of people, categories of agencies. We have divided the state into 5 regions, and so each of those regions we have regional teams And those are the ways in which people become members of the task force through these regional teams. And each regional team has a lot of law enforcement, as you might imagine, some prosecutors, that makes sense. But we also involve service providers, and in some cases, even people from the medical community, people who are very invested and very well positioned to see and address not only the crime and the enforcement of it, but also to address the effects that this has on victims and to help survivors thrive eventually.
You just put up a bunch of posters in Nebraska's rest areas. Why there?
So among other things, we've noticed that there is a lot of sex trafficking that is cyclical, or it's a part of a pattern that they're in Chicago one night, the next night they're in St. Louis, they're in Kansas City, and then they're in Omaha, and then they're in Grand Island, and then they're out further west, North Platte, onto Denver. And so I-80 is really a pretty significant route for sex trafficking operations. So we presume that some of them will stop at rest areas, and we hope that the general public, as they're there, they'll see these posters. There's a QR code there you can snap, and it pulls up a website that gives a lot of tips and some things to look for. And we hope more and more Nebraskans will become informed about this and be able to tell us when they see it, because all our training doesn't do any good until we actually see it somewhere and can actually start moving forward. I found in Nebraska, once people understand that this is happening in our state, and not just once or twice a decade, but kind of all the time, many places across the state, that Nebraskans are not okay with that. And so the unicameral has stepped up with some very good laws that are very effective tools now that we can use. And I think the future is bright in making this a hostile place to do human trafficking.
Park says we all can help in the fight against trafficking. We do that by becoming more informed on what's happening and how to spot it. That's exactly what the trucking industry's been doing, and with some pretty amazing results. We talk with the Knights of the Highway when KETV News Watch 7's Chronicle continues.
I'm telling you how you can make a global impact. Let's say this mask is $5.75.